Audio Jungle.
John Loos, revered economist. John, I want to have a financial and property conversation with you. Interest rates are climbing, sentiment is down, load shedding increases. Would you be buying or selling property right now?
Well, Craig, okay, let's talk about longer term cycles first. I always like to go into what I call super cycles.
Broad-based.
The ideal buying opportunity, the great buying opportunity for property as a whole that you may get once or twice in a lifetime, I don't think is here yet. Okay, right. The last big buying opportunity was arguably the late 1990s. Property values were rock bottom compared to now, and interest rates were sky high. That's why one of the reasons why property was rock bottom. And people who bought then, whether it's commercial or residential, they saw massive capital growth in the subsequent years, in the property boom years up until about 2008. So we're not there yet. I think we're still in the longer term correction phase because of this economic stagnation, economic policy that needs to be improved. There's a myriad of structural issues that economists talk about. So that's that perfect buying opportunity I don't think is here yet. But there are shorter run opportunities that improve or get less attractive, and at the moment I would say that the market's probably moving more in the buyer's direction, to becoming more a buyer's direction and away from the seller, because interest rates are climbing, because inflation has been climbing. It takes disposable income out of consumers' pockets. There's increased speculation about the possibility even of recession. And that's now we don't believe that the First Rand doesn't forecast a recession just yet, but there are some that are talking that possibility. And if you look at what's going on in the world, all the negative events, not only here, it's not out of the question. That typically dampens the property market. It puts stress on certain property owners as well, and they have to offload. So it is a period where a buyer can drive a harder bargain. So it becomes more of a buyer's market.
So, I mean, you don't get a feeling that there's money around. I mean, deals and transactions are happening, but you don't drive around and feel that there's a buzz in the air right now in the property space, right?
No, and it's exactly when there isn't a buzz in the property space, when the property market is down and cooled off, that's when the better buying opportunities are. Obviously, it's not when... I think as Warren Buffett used to say, be greedy when others are scared and be scared when others are greedy. The seasoned property investor, I think, goes in counter to the cycle. When everybody's buying, he's probably not buying.
How do we detect the noise? How do we make sense of the noise as to when the sentiment will turn or the opportunities appear? What do we look for when it comes to buying property? I mean, what are the signs, the road signs?
Look, I think when you looking at economic numbers, which may give you a clue that a better buying opportunity is coming in property, it's probably things like declines in business confidence, declines in consumer confidence, economists increasingly talking about recession, inflation rising, interest rates rising. Those are, sort of what we would call negative economic data from an economic growth point of view. That's generally a dampener on property, and then it becomes a better buyer's market. Normally, a more oversupplied market. There isn't as much property demand, and therefore it's a better buyer's market. But those are the typical economic numbers you would look for, and to the contrary, an improving market which becomes less of a buyer's market, more of a seller's market. Well, that's typically business confidence picking up, consumer confidence picking up, economic growth prospects picking up, inflation coming down, interest rates set to decline. That type, there's just exactly the opposite. Interest rates being key in short-term property cycles because it's a highly credit-dependent market.
Would you agree with the sentiment that, most people believe that we're finished with COVID, but I don't necessarily believe that COVID is finished with us? Do you believe with that? sentiment is potentially accurate right now?
I think it is potentially accurate. I think it's accurate. If you look at what COVID brought, it brought about, for instance, serious supply chain disruptions in the world. And, just recently we had a big Chinese lockdown, and we know how important Chinese is for global manufacturing and supply chains. So I don't think the disruption is quite finished yet. I think that we've seen globally unrest picking up. I think a portion of that, look, a lot of it has to do with the Ukraine conflict now and the Russia boycotts and sanctions, which pose their own supply chain disruptions to the world. And, food prices and petrol prices going upwards, and that brings about normally increase in social unrest. So part of it's that. But I think a part of it too is overhangs from the lockdown period of COVID, the supply chain disruptions, which initially brought about this much higher inflation. The US, for instance, having the highest inflation rates in something like 40 years. And that typically can bring about further disruption because of the social unrest and unhappiness amongst citizens of many countries of the world. So I don't think COVID is finished with us, no.
I mean, in essence, we're back, but we're not back to normal. No. And so the tail end of what's happening in the world will affect us based on, I mean, this is kind of the foresight that we could have, that we may be 3 or 6 months behind what potentially is happening in China. So we will experience that tail end of the manufacturing, the distribution, 3 months or 6 months down the line.
Yeah, I mean, we do experience it. It's difficult to go into the detail, but there will be certain suppliers that are experiencing it and will experience it more. So, I mean, just to take a simple example, for the past few years, when I visit my favorite bicycle shop, I mean, bicycles have been in short supply globally.
I mean, that's interesting
because of these COVID disruptions, and it doesn't seem to me like if I look at the shelves, that they're sorted out entirely yet. But there's another aspect to COVID as well, is that it fast-tracked certain long-term trends. For one, the work-from-home trend. Now, the work-from-home trend has been gathering steam for a few decades. As technology improves, we've been able to be more mobile. Back in the 70s, if you weren't next to your filing cabinet and your filing rooms in your big office block, you could not do any work, for many of us. Well, I wasn't there in the 70s, but as technologies improved, and email came along, and internet came along, and logging into systems remotely, and laptops, and so we've become more and more mobile, and so we've been increasingly working remotely, be it part-time or part of the time or full-time. And COVID came along and dramatically fast-tracked that. It forced all the late adopters to give this a bash. They found out that it was not without its shortcomings, but it was amazingly successful, that whole divisions of banks could work totally remotely. It was amazing how quickly we adjusted.
But we discovered that tech didn't support COVID. I mean, the interconnectivity and the difficulty to connect and to get online, and reception and load shedding. So whilst they gave it a bash, it became difficult to work remotely.
Well, I don't know if it became difficult. It became far easier because everybody else had adopted it. So those of us who wanted to work more remotely could, because it was acceptable.
Yeah.
So the point is that
it gave an excuse for that too.
Yeah, it's acceptable for me to have online meetings now with people. I used to try and do that with people instead of travel across the city.
They would think it's rude.
And they would think it's rude. Now it's acceptable. So a lot has changed. And office attendance is not back at the numbers that it was. I don't know what office attendances are now, but the offices that I go into, visiting or my own head office, it's not there, and I don't think it's ever going to be there again. So there's a legacy there of COVID for the office sector. It has to.
I mean, corporate South Africa want to bring people back. I mean, you get this feeling that they want to bring people back into the environment because the energy has dissipated.
Well, I think some companies do, but then there's always in a competitive environment, there's always the opportunist. In the US, where there's more information coming out, you see certain companies saying, hang on a moment, I'll use this as a carrot to attract skills. You can work more flexibly. I'll give you flexibility. You can work from home. I read a little article of, I think it was Google or Microsoft poaching a top Goldman Sachs artificial intelligence specialists.
Yes, yes.
Goldman Sachs had a very hard line. They wanted everybody back in the office in New York last year. I think they've relaxed that since. And one of these companies came along and said, you can work from home in Argentina, we don't mind. And guess what the employee found more attractive? Well, not Goldman Sachs. So that was a report I read. I've read that the hardliners, Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan Chase, who wanted everybody back at the office, have been relaxing because the others take their skills, promise them more flexibility, and the labour market is then shifting the more the old-fashioned, old-school companies who want everybody in the office is shifting them, forcing them, because you know what, we've got alternatives. We can go and top skills can work elsewhere where there's more flexibility. More of the employees want flexibility, and that's the labour market is driving employers in that direction. So I don't think we will spend. I mean, offices aren't dead. But, there will be a certain portion of office space, and I believe that there has to be a certain amount of in-person interaction. I buy that. But it's not, I don't believe, going to be near the levels of what it was prior to COVID-19. Sure. That means less demand for office space. So that's a big, important, big change that COVID brought about.
And obviously in the commercial space where you're setting all these commercial buildings, whoever purchases, even if you purchase at the right value in this time, you've still got to find occupants, you've still got to find tenants. Sure. So you've still got to rent the space out or come up with a creative way to be able to showcase what you've bought.
Sure.
And then, of course, you've got the aggravating concern of rates and taxes and electricity and all the negatives which are incapacitating the tenants today and landlords.
Sure.
And the tech is a real problem.
Yeah. So. And the response of the market is, yes, rentals have been declining. That needs to happen as demand has declined, and values of office space in many cases have been declining, and and office landlords have world over have been having to redesign the offices to create. They talk about more collaborative space. I don't think it's only that. You need more private space too. We're Zoomifying our interactions, and we need sort of what they call telephone booths, soundproof telephone booths, much more of them in buildings. So buildings are outdated all of a sudden, need to be redesigned. So there's a lot of scurrying to catch up. But then, I think the reality is a lot of office space gets repurposed as well into residential and the likes.
So, John, I want to ask you a very, very important question. If you could raise a magic wand and you could shift and change sentiment, what would be the magic key points that you would adopt to turn the economy or turn sentiment towards property?
Well, I think what's required is big economic policy changes. The economy, the property market is about the economy at the end of the day. Well, interest rates are part of that, but it's not just about interest rates, it's about economic growth. If it's retail, it's about consumers that have money, that buy goods and services at shop and entertain themselves in malls. If it's about office space, it's about greater employment numbers, not just about working where you work from, but greater employment numbers in services sectors. So it's about economic growth, sustainable economic growth. And so, then you move to the structural reforms that are required in South Africa. And there's a myriad of them. The electricity sector being the most troublesome at the moment, or the most visibly troublesome, but it's not just that. I mean, the railway sector is virtually closed down. There's a whole lot of other stuff too. I believe that, if I can put it simply in a minute or so because of time, that government has to withdraw from delivery. Its role must be regulatory. Where it has developed well-regulated competition models for the private sector to compete in, such as the financial sector, we've proved we can be world-class. The financial sector of South Africa is rated as one of the best in the world. Where we have protected monopolies and other sort of less economic sensible models, that's where we tend to fail. So government must be the regulator and do it well. It's a smaller government. It's like FIFA regulates soccer. It doesn't play the game at all.
Right.
And the private sector must compete, not in a free market. Free markets can be absolutely shambolic. in a well-regulated, competitive environment, you start moving that type of principle to things like the electricity sector, the transport sector, and others. And I think you can relatively quickly improve the economic performance of the country. Not stamp out all the problems, but improve it significantly. And at that stage, then, I think that your property market starts to turn, its performance starts to improve on a far more sustainable basis.
Sure. And of course, with people out there looking at their lifestyle and looking at their environment, security, and all issues relating to just living in South Africa, how long do you think it would take for under the current situation, the way that it is, not waving that magic wand, for us to evolve, to get to another plateau of positivity?
I think that some significant political change has to happen first. I think what you probably need is a ruling party, whoever that's going to be, that is more unified in terms of policy thinking. I think that the current one is probably too broad a church with too diverse views on everything. And then you struggle to get things done. I think that Margaret Thatcher, when she reformed the UK, implemented very serious structural reforms, a lot of privatization, a lot of deregulation, all sorts of stuff. She needed a unified ruling party behind her. I think that's a prerequisite. That's probably some way off. I'm not a political analyst, but that's probably some way off. And you get to that stage, and then you can probably implement more the structural reforms. I think that the government, there are signs that it wants to implement structural reforms, or at least a part of government does. Finally, a sale of a stake in SAAs on the table.
Sure.
There's time slots for private companies to run on the railways. Probably too little. From what I read, to have an impact, but it's a start, of the noise, the positive noise.
Sure.
And even now, talk of allowing the private sector, speeding up and getting rid of some of the red tape or whatever to get the private sector more involved in electricity. So I think that a portion of government and the ruling party does accept that this is the way it has to go, and that's a very positive development. But it's there's got to be far more done at a quick rate.
But they've come to the notion that they could be a partner, whereas in the past it was just not possible to partner government.
Yeah, no.
They've realised
there's a shift.
There's a shift.
I mean, look, I think it's the reality is that if you look at this country, I mean, we've got some of the best performing sectors in the world, and I point to parts of the financial sector. And then you've got some of the worst performing ones in the world. When you just start looking at maths and science education and the competitiveness rankings,
Sure.
We rank rock bottom, worse than even countries on this continent. We really fare poorly. Countries that are often much poorer and worse resourced than us do better in that. So we've got this gross inequality in performance across sectors, and of course the underperforming ones hold the top performing ones back.
Yes.
That's what happens. So you've got to sort of equalize that somehow.
So privatization as a goal plan, as a goal set, is potentially the way to go to a degree.
I think so. I mean, that's maybe people say, well, that's the way I've been indoctrinated in my economics education. But yes, I think that as I say, I think that the natural split. I don't call myself a socialist or a communist or a free marketeer. I believe, if you want to look at a model that, makes sense to me, look at sporting codes, professional sporting codes. The governing body is seen as the regulator. And there's never really talk of FIFA owning football clubs and delivering the product, So
they're not operational.
No, they're a small, relatively small organization,
Compact.
very powerful in terms of decision making, but relatively small. And they regulate. They regulate in ways to build a model of competition, which is not free. It's highly regulated. There's everything.
But they own the brand.
Yeah, they own the brand, and it's anti-doping regulations and goal line technology and referees.
Compliance.
And, there's a huge amount of regulation, but it's a well-structured, or they try to get a well-structured competitive model where, my kids under 11 club cricket team doesn't play against the Proteas because they'll get killed. You protect the new entrants to the market to a degree, and you've got leagues, and it's a very well thought out competitive model. Now, obviously, competitive models will differ from sector to sector. But that's the principle. Well-regulated, well-thought-out competition can drive human performance up,
Sure.
And we've seen it in this country where we do have well-regulated competitive models. Not free markets, I don't believe, but well-regulated competition. And as I say, I think, the banking sector, you don't have to like the banking sector, but it is one of the better rated ones on the planet. It's,
The takeout of this conversation for me is that there's been a shift in government in the sense that they're open to the suggestion of state-owned entity being partnered. That is a step in the right direction. That must, in time, breed positive sentiment towards property.
I think so. Yeah, I think that there is a shift starting to happen. As I said, it's early days, and there'll be.
What's the timeline, John? Putting you on the spot. What do you think? I mean, we're talking property, we're talking sentiment in property. Yeah. I mean, it's a great shift there. Yeah. But I mean, people are on the fence right now. Should I buy? Should I sell? We go back to that first question. I mean, we know how to spot the opportunities. I mean, opportunities are there. It's what to do with these opportunities, and are we going to be restricted? So timeline attached to this.
I mean, it's tough to put timelines to it. Look, I don't recommend people buy and sell property for various reasons. So there's never, they can't all wait until that great buying opportunity that I talk about that comes along once in a lifetime. But I think it becomes a better buyer's market in the next few years. Yeah. I think although there's starting to become an economic policy shift, which is very early signs of that we could see the positive structural reforms more significantly in years to come. I think that there's early hints. When do they start making a meaningful impact to the economy? Well, I think there's got to be far more measures first. And it's probably a good few years away. But if I could put a timeline to it, I'd say by the end of this decade. It's still quite a way.
Sure.
I think we would have. I'm guessing that we would have seen quite significant structural reform.
I mean, that's exciting. I mean, it's definitely futuristic, but planning stuff that we can work with right now.
Yeah, it's tough to predict, and there's obviously with more radical change, there's also radical resistance. So sometimes it can feel as though you're going a step back because there's various vested interests in organizations, and when any organization, I mean a private sector organization, when restructuring, that horrible word of restructuring starts, people fight, and people, and there's a volatile situation, and it's turbulent for a while to get through that change. Humans don't always take kindly to change.
Sure.
So it can be, the process of change can be quite, when you start implementing structural reforms, can be quite turbulent as resistance to it happens.
John Loos, fascinating chatting to you. I could go on all day, but this has been absolutely pivotal to the property and financial sector in this discussion, and you've given me great insight and our audience. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure, Craig.